The cage smelled like ozone and copper, and Sergeant Mara Voss had been counting the seconds for 11 hours and 43 minutes. She knew because of the thing they had done to her brain, not the aliens, her own side doctor. Yen had explained it 3 times before she went under. A chronosync implant no bigger than a grain of sand, lodged behind her left ear, ticking like a heartbeat that was not quite hers. It kept time to the nearest second. It was supposed to help with mission coordination. Instead, it told her she had 17 minutes left before her window closed, and then she would sleep whether she wanted to or not. The Vorath called it a disease. She called it a clock. The Vorath called her kind weak for having it. 12 hours of function, 12 hours of dormancy, a biological rhythm hardwired into human neurology that no one had fully understood until the Vorath scanners had lit up the moment first contact shuttles broke atmosphere and identified the condition in every single member of the crew. The aliens had named it before humans did. They called it the holocycle, a gap in consciousness they considered evidence of an inferior species. Beings who spent half their existence in darkness, in helplessness, in a state indistinguishable from death. It had taken the Vorath approximately 4 months to decide that humanity was not worth negotiating with. It had taken humanity 3 years to realize the thing they called a weakness might be the only card left to play. The first human xenologist to speak directly to a Vorath commander had been a woman named Dr. Petra Harlow, and she had lasted 11 minutes before the Vorath ended the session and filed their assessment. That assessment, intercepted and translated 14 months later, read, "The subjects are not capable of sustained adversarial negotiation. Their cognitive continuity is structurally compromised. They enter periods of full neural suspension without warning or preparation. They conduct their most critical intellectual work in a state of time-limited awareness, which they do not appear to perceive as a liability. This lack of self-awareness regarding a fundamental biological deficit suggests a species-level inability to accurately assess their own limitations. We recommend the recalibration of contact strategy toward resource acquisition rather than alliance building." Mara had read this assessment in a briefing file 2 years ago, sitting in an anteroom on the 7th floor of the Strategic Analysis Center in Geneva, waiting to speak to a colonel she had never met about a program she had only been told about in the vaguest terms. She had read it twice. Then she had laughed. A short, quiet laugh, the kind you gave to something that was insulting in a way that also accidentally illuminated something. True about both parties. They lacked self-awareness, the Vorath had written. They did not perceive their limitation as a liability. Yes, Mara had thought. That's the part you got right. That's exactly the part you got right, and you don't know why it matters yet. Mara rolled her shoulder against the cage bar. The material was some kind of crystallized resin, honeygold and translucent, warm to the touch in a way that felt almost biological. The entire holding chamber was carved from it, the floor, the ceiling, the arch of the doorway where 2 Vorath soldiers stood with their backs to her, spines tall and slightly forward curved, the way they always stood, like something permanently about to strike. Their armor was matte obsidian, jointed at the thorax in 3 places, and the ridge crests that ran from the base of their skulls to the tops of their shoulders were fully extended. Threat display. Even guarding a human prisoner, they were in threat posture, as if she might still surprise them. She intended to. Her name was Sergeant Mara Voss, and she had been in Vorath captivity for 6 days. She had been held in 4 different locations across what the intelligence reports called the Equatorial Processing Belt, a chain of installation complexes the Vorath used to break down captured war assets, weapons, equipment, soldiers. The distinction, for the Vorath, was not meaningful. Everything was material to be understood and then discarded. She had watched them do it to Corporal Baines. She did not let herself think about Baines. Her sister, Dr. Sarah Voss, was 3 installations away, or had been, the last time Mara had visual confirmation, which was 42 hours ago. Sarah was not a soldier. Sarah was a xenobiologist attached to the 14th Expeditionary Medical Corps, and she had been captured in the same raid, pulled from an evacuation transport that had the bad luck to fly through a Vorath intercept corridor, while Mara's strike team was 3 kilometers away doing absolutely nothing useful. Mara had seen the transport go down from the ridge, had watched it drop behind the burning tree line, had understood in the space between one heartbeat and the next exactly what that meant. She had surrendered 40 minutes later, walked up to the Vorath patrol with her hands visible, and her translator chip broadcasting on the frequency Colonel Dar had told her would work. It had worked. They had taken her alive. That was the plan, or most of it. The rest of the plan was the thing behind her left ear and the thing in her bloodstream, and the 17, now 16 minutes she had left before she found out whether Dr. Yen had been right about all of it. The Varath who came to see her at hour 11 and 51 minutes was not a soldier. She was young. Mara had learned enough Vorath biology to read age in the crest coloration, and this one's ridgeline was still transitioning from the deep copper of youth to the darker burgundy of maturity. She wore no armor. Her clothing was layered fabric in gradients of gray and blue, the kind of formal dress that indicated status rather than function, and she carried herself with the loose-limbed confidence of someone who had never had a reason to be afraid of anything in a room. She stood outside the cage bars and looked at Mara the way someone looks at an animal they find vaguely repellent but cannot stop examining. "You are the one who surrendered voluntarily," she said. Her translator chip, embedded at the base of her throat, visible as a slight raised node, rendered her voice into clean, flat standard. No inflection. The Vorath didn't need inflection for condescension. They put it in their posture. "I am," Mara said. "Why? It wasn't quite a question." The young Vorath tilted her head, crest fanning slightly, curiosity. Mara had learned, not aggression. "I was looking for someone," Mara said. "Your sibling unit." The biological researcher. The young Vorath made a short gesture with 3 fingers. Dismissal, or maybe acknowledgement. "She is alive. She is being processed in the secondary analytical hold. Her holocycle is more pronounced than yours. She sleeps 14 hours per rotation." Mara absorbed this. 14 hours. Sarah had always been worse than her. Had been the reason they'd been recruited for the program in the first place. The more pronounced the cycle, the more compatible with the protocol. Dr. Yen had pulled them both from the volunteer pool within the same week, and Mara had signed on first, and Sarah had followed, the way Sarah always followed, quietly and without making a fuss, and then proven to be twice as valuable. It had been that way since childhood. Sarah the one who seemed to be behind, Sarah the younger one, Sarah who slept more and needed more dark, and then Sarah who outpaced everyone when the light was right. "Is she injured?" Mara asked. "Cosmetically. Nothing that impairs her analytical function." The young Vorath crouched, a surprisingly fluid movement, bringing herself to eye level with Mara, who was sitting cross-legged on the cage floor because standing for 6 days wore out even trained muscle. "You concern me less than she does. You are a combat unit. The extraction of useful information from combat units follows a known methodology. But the researcher, she has been attempting to communicate with our analytical staff. In your language and in ours, she has been asking questions about our biological literature." "That sounds like her," Mara said. "It is strange behavior for a prisoner. She's a scientist. It's normal behavior for her regardless of context." The young Vorath was quiet for a moment. Her crest shifted, the slow oscillation Mara associated with active thinking rather than social performance. She was, Mara noted, genuinely curious. Not performing an interrogation, not running a methodology, actually curious, in the way that young people who have spent their whole lives being told they are correct, and then encountered something that didn't fit the category, are curious, with a quality of resistance that coexists with the curiosity, because admitting curiosity means admitting that the category wasn't incomplete. Mara recognized the feeling. She had been that age once. She had been wrong about things with that same quality of resistance. "You are not afraid," she said at last. "I'm afraid," Mara said. "I'm just not going to show you. Why not?" "Because it wouldn't help anything." Another long pause. The 2 guards at the door hadn't moved. Mara could feel her chronosync ticking behind her ear. 11 minutes. "You are entering your dormancy period soon," the young Vorath said. It was not phrased as a question. She had obviously been monitoring. "About 11 minutes, yeah. Does it distress you? The loss of consciousness? The gap?" "Not anymore." Mara looked at her evenly. "We grow up with it. It's just part of the day. You spend half your existence helpless. You spend your whole existence not knowing what the dark feels like." Mara paused. "I'm not sure which of us is missing more." The young Varath stood, her crest pulled tight, not aggression, something more like offense taken, but controlled. She was not used to being answered this way. She was, Mara thought, used to either fear or compliance, and was encountering neither, and was not quite sure what to do with that except keep asking. Which was actually the right thing to do. Mara thought slightly better of her for it. "I am Vel Shara, first daughter of Commander Velorath, who directs this installation complex. I came to observe you because my analysis models suggested your voluntary surrender indicated a hidden protocol. I have not been able to identify what that protocol is. This is unusual for me." "Your analysis models aren't wrong," Mara said. Velshara stared at her. "I do have a hidden protocol," Mara said. "I'm just not going to tell you what it is. You are a very strange human. I get that a lot." Velshara left without another word. The guards remained. Mara closed her eyes, not because she was tired. She wasn't. Quite yet. But because she wanted to run the numbers one more time before the window closed. 8 minutes. The compound that Dr. Yen had injected into her bloodstream 3 weeks ago was called Compound Lana, because Dr. Yen had a daughter named Lana and Doctor. Yen was the kind of person who named things after people she loved. The official designation was CX-12 Neuroadaptive, and it had taken 4 years and 17 failed iterations to produce. And when Dr. Yen had described what it did, she had used the word unprecedented, so many times that Colonel Dar had finally asked her to use a different word. She had thought about it for almost a full minute and then used it again, because there wasn't a better one, and Dar had sighed and said, "Fine." The thing it did was this: it interrupted the hollow cycle, not permanently, not at will. The cycle still happened, still swept through on its 12-hour rhythm, still dropped the human brain into dormancy. But in the 6 hours before dormancy, the period doctor, Yen called the transition window, Compound Lana rewired the neurological architecture in a way that made the human brain emit a very specific kind of signal. A signal that, according to every scan and every model and every test run on the 17 volunteers who had survived the protocol, was functionally identical to the signal produced by a Vorath consciousness lock. The Vorath used consciousness locks to interface with their technology. Every piece of Vorath hardware, weapons, navigation, communications, the crystalline processing arrays that ran their installations, was keyed to Vorath neurological output. It was their most fundamental security system. It was why no human had ever successfully operated captured Vorath equipment. The hardware would not respond to human neural signatures. Until now. Until 6 hours before dormancy. Until the transition window, when the human brain, reconfigured by Compound Lana, sang in the right frequency. There were unintended consequences. Dr. Yen had been very honest about this. The transition window didn't just make human brains emit the right signal. It made them receive signals too, bleed through from every piece of Vorath tech in range. A wash of alien data that hit the augmented human nervous system like standing too close to a radio tower. Most volunteers reported it as noise at first. Then, as the weeks passed and the compound integrated further, the noise became something else. Patterns. Intent. Not language. The volunteers couldn't read Vorath thoughts. But they could feel the shape of them, the architecture of attention. Where a Vorath soldier was looking, what they were about to do, which direction an attack was going to come from. It felt, as one of the other volunteers had described it, like being able to hear the color of things. Dr. Yen had called it cross-resonance. She had been cautiously optimistic. She had also told every volunteer very clearly that there was no reversing it. Compound Lana was permanent. The neurological rewiring did not undo itself. For the rest of their lives, every human who had taken it would enter the transition window before dormancy, would emit and receive, would hear the color of Vorath intentions. Mara had said yes before Dr. Yen finished explaining. Sarah had said yes too, the quiet way, the way that meant she'd already decided, and was waiting for permission to commit. 4 minutes. The transition window was already open. Had been for 2 hours. Mara had been feeling the installation around her since she'd hit hour 10, a soft, constant pressure at the edges of her awareness, like a crowd of people all breathing in unison just out of sight. The guard's attention was steady and slightly bored, 2 bright points of focus that she could read like heat signatures. The cage itself was passive, but deeper in the installation, through the resin walls and down the curved corridors she had memorized during her daily transfer rotations, she could feel the processing systems running, could feel the data moving through the crystalline arrays like water through pipes, and she could feel faintly, distantly, but unmistakably the location signatures of every Vorath in the complex and Sarah's. Sarah was a human signal, warm and familiar, 40 meters east and 1 level down, and currently in her own transition window, she was within 30 seconds of Mara's cycle, had always run almost synchronous with her, and Mara could feel her sister the way she could feel her own heartbeat, steady and distinct and alive. She'd been holding on to that signal for 6 days like a line thrown into the dark, the only fixed point in 6 days of careful stillness and performance and strategic patience. Some nights, the 12 hours of dormancy, the dark half of the clock, she surfaced briefly in the shallow water before deep sleep pulled her back down, and in those liminal seconds she'd had a recurring awareness of the signal, faint and far away but present, and the awareness was enough to keep the fear below the level of operational interference. She was afraid. She'd told Velshara the truth about that. A soldier who claimed not to be afraid was either lying or had stopped paying attention, and Mara had always paid close attention to everything. She had been holding onto that signal for 6 days. The plan was simple. Simple enough that Mara had described it to Colonel Dar in under 2 minutes, and Dar had spent 4 hours trying to find the flaw in it, and had finally said, "There is no flaw in the logic, but there are 17 ways it kills you." And Mara had said, "Yes, sir." And Dar had stared at her across the briefing table and said, "I want Voss's full records pulled, and I want her psych eval reviewed." And the psych officer had come back an hour later and said, "She's not suicidal, sir. She just calculates survival differently than most people," which was accurate. The plan was, get captured, get inside, wait for the transition window, use the cross-resonance to locate every significant system in the installation, find Sarah, get them both out through the service access that every Varath installation had in the same place. She'd seen it in 4 facilities so far. Same position, same configuration, a vestigial design feature from older construction methodology, and while exiting, interface with the installation's primary communications array and broadcast everything the cross-resonance had, let her absorb on a frequency that the 14th Expeditionary Signals Team would intercept, decode, and use to identify and map the entire regional installation network. It was a good plan. It was also a plan that required Mara to move in the last 3 minutes before dormancy dropped her, because the moment she slept, the window closed and the resonance cut out, and she'd be just another captured human in a cage. She stood up. The guards turned. Later, when she had time to think about it, Mara would decide that the most important thing Dr. Yen had told them about cross-resonance was not about the data transmission or the system interface or even the attack pattern reading. It was this. The cross-resonance was not one-directional. When Mara could feel the guards' attention, the guards could also, on some level below language, below conscious processing, feel her, not her location, not her intent, but her state, the quality of her awareness. And a human in the last 3 minutes of the transition window, carrying 4 years of compound integration and 6 days of concentrated focus, produced a resonance output that the Vorath nervous system registered as something it had no name for, something that didn't fit the categories, something that made the deep, old animal parts of the Vorath brain do what deep, old animal parts do when they encounter something they cannot categorize. They flinched. Not physically. The guards did not visibly flinch. They stood their posts. Their weapons came up. Their crests extended in threat display. Everything they were trained to do, happening correctly. But they flinched inside it. Mara felt it. The hesitation, the microsecond of recategorization. Is this a threat or isn't it? The answer their training gave was yes. The answer the resonance gave was unknown. Unknown is worse than threat. Unknown is the thing the old brain hates. She hit the cage lock at a dead run, and her fingers found the interface panel in the transition window, sang through her, and the lock opened. Not because she had a key, because the lock's own system recognized the signal, because for 3 beautiful, terrifying minutes, her brain was speaking the right language. She didn't stop to watch the guards process it. The corridors of the installation ran amber in the indirect light of the processing arrays. They curved, always curved. The Varath had no architecture with right angles, and she ran with the resonance ahead of her like headlights, reading the positions of every warm body in the building, routing around the clusters of soldiers, sliding through the empty spaces between patrols with the kind of precision that was not luck and was not training, but was the specific gift of hearing the color of other people's intentions. 40 meters, 1 level down. A stairway that was not quite a stairway. Vorath ramps spiral, clockwise, descending, and she hit the lower level at speed. And the door at the end of the corridor was the same crystalline resin as everything. Else in the lock on it was a more complex system, a 3-stage array that she could feel but not immediately parse. And she had maybe 90 seconds before dormancy, so she pressed both palms flat against the panel and she pushed. The resonance opened up like a door in her chest. It wasn't comfortable. It was never comfortable, Dr. Yen had warned her, the way a muscle tear isn't comfortable, even when it's healing correctly. A sensation of something fundamental being stretched past its normal range, of the nervous system performing a function it was designed for, but it only recently learned it could do. She felt the lock system, felt its 3 stages, the progression of checks, and she didn't so much operate it as become temporarily continuous with it, her awareness and its processing overlapping for the handful of seconds it took to resolve all 3 stages simultaneously. The door opened. The room beyond was smaller than she expected. Low ceiling, warm amber light, and 6 holding spaces arranged in a ring around a central analytical console that was powered down. Still, dark dormant. Sarah was in the 3rd space on the left. She was sitting against the back wall with her knees drawn up and a data slate she'd apparently been given, at some point balanced on her thighs, and she was writing on it. Writing. In captivity, in an alien installation, with less than a minute before her own dormancy window closed, her younger sister was taking notes. Mara, Sarah said. She did not sound surprised. We have about 60 seconds, Mara said. Come on, Sarah stood. She set the data slate down with the careful precision of someone who hoped to come back for it. She did not ask any questions. This was one of the things Mara loved most about her sister, the absolute trust, the complete absence of the kind of panic that required explanation before action. Sarah had been following her for 32 years. She knew how Mara worked. They ran. The service access was exactly where it always was. Every Vorath installation, across every site, the 14th Expeditionary had analyzed, placed its service access at the northeast junction of the tertiary processing level, a decision that appeared to be rooted in some combination of structural engineering and what Mara had begun to think of as genuine architectural conservatism. The Vorath built the way their ancestors had built. They trusted what had worked before. It was a quality Mara respected and intended to exploit until it stopped working. The access shaft was narrow. It was meant for maintenance drones, not bipedal organisms of either species, and getting through it required the specific kind of determined contortion that you only developed after spending your career in small, uncomfortable spaces. Mara went first. Sarah followed, still without questions, still without complaints, with the focused silence of someone operating on the last of their window and determined not to waste a second of it. The shaft opened onto an exterior maintenance platform 8 meters above the ground surface. The night sky above the Vorath installation was huge and dark and full of stars that did not arrange themselves into any constellation Mara recognized, and the air was cold and thin and smelled of the mineral-rich soil that lay across the entire equatorial belt. The external communications array was mounted on the installation's eastern face, 40 meters up, accessible by the external maintenance lattice. Mara had seen it from the air during her capture approach, had noted the position, had filed it in the part of her memory where she stored things she expected to need. She looked at Sarah. Sarah looked at the array. How long? Sarah asked. 20 seconds, maybe. The resonance is almost gone. Is it enough time? Mara thought about everything she'd absorbed in 6 days. Every system she'd felt the shape of. Every communication channel, every patrol rotation, every installation in the regional network that had been broadcasting its address into the local crystalline array infrastructure, because the Vorath didn't encrypt local communications the way they encrypted external ones. Why would they? No one inside an installation was unauthorized. No one was supposed to be speaking a language the system would respond to. Yes, she said. If I can get to the array. Go, Sarah said. I'll be right behind you. She was 14 seconds into dormancy when she reached the array. Mara Voss had been a soldier for 11 years. She had served on 3 continents and 2 orbital platforms. She had trained under 4 different commanding officers and had been formally cited for exceptional performance under pressure by 3 of them, and informally chewed out for creative insubordination by all 4. She was not given to melodrama, did not believe in fate, and was not the kind of person who marked moments. But she would remember this one, the cold of the alien night, the lattice metal under her palms, the last seconds of the window burning down like a match, and her hands on the communications array panel, and the resonance opening one final time, huge and close and overwhelming, like diving into a deep body of water, and everything she'd gathered in 6 days of captivity, every address and frequency and patrol pattern and installation coordinate, flowing out of her like breath, like something returning to where it came from. She felt the signals team pick it up. Not literally, they were hundreds of kilometers away, but she felt the array receive her transmission, felt it branch and propagate through the regional network exactly as intended, felt it go. Then the dormancy hit. She had time to grab the lattice with both hands before she stopped being conscious. She woke to Sarah's voice, which was the same as every morning of her childhood and every morning of the past 3 years, and was, she had decided, approximately the best way to wake up that existed. I've got you, Sarah said. I've got you, Mara. Don't move yet. You're on a ledge. She was on a ledge, right? The maintenance platform, external face of the installation, night and cold, and her sister's hands on her shoulders, keeping her from rolling off the edge where the lattice had caught her. Did it transmit? Mara asked. Her voice came out rough. I don't know. I was watching you, not the array. The array light changed. I saw it before I went under. She tested her fingers. They worked. She tested her arms, her legs, the slow inventory she always ran in the first 30 seconds of waking. Everything accounted for. Nothing broken. We need to move before they realize the cage is empty. They already know, Sarah said quietly. Mara looked up. Through the exterior maintenance lattice, through the amber-lit windows of the installation's upper levels, she could see the shadows of Vorith soldiers moving. Not panicked movement, methodical, organized. The search patterns of a trained security force working outward from a confirmed breach point. How long was I under? 40 minutes. Long enough for them to have found the open cage. Long enough to have initiated search protocols. Not long enough, she hoped, to have thought to check the external maintenance platform, but that window was closing. Can you run? She asked Sarah. Yes. How's your window? Just opened. Maybe 5 minutes ago. Mara sat up. The cold hit her fully for the first time, and she accepted it the way she accepted most things. That were uncomfortable and unavoidable, acknowledged it, cataloged it, filed it as irrelevant. The ground was 8 meters down. The installation perimeter was lit by the amber ground lights the Vorath used for exterior illumination, warm and directional, leaving pools of shadow between the light cones. The tree line was 40 meters from the perimeter wall, but the 14th Expeditionary's closest forward operating position was 11 kilometers northeast. 11 kilometers in Vorith-held territory, with an active search underway after 12 hours of sleep on a maintenance ledge. She had done worse. The jump won't break anything, Sarah asked, looking at the drop. Probably not, tuck and roll. I did study some biology at university, you know. I understand impact mechanics. Then you know why I said tuck and roll. Mara stood. The lattice swayed slightly. She looked at her sister, at Sarah's face in the alien light, younger than hers by 4 years, calm in the way that was either courage or just the specific quality of Sarah's personality, which had always been a difficult thing to distinguish from courage. I'm sorry I got you captured. Sarah raised an eyebrow. You weren't there when the transport went down. I was supposed to be. No, you were supposed to be 3 kilometers away doing the thing Dar assigned you, which you were. Sarah paused. Was this actually a rescue, or was I incidental? Mara said nothing. I was incidental, Sarah said, not with any heat in it, just the calm acknowledgement of fact. The intelligence operation was the primary objective, and I was a beneficial side effect. You were never incidental. Mara, Sarah, they looked at each other. The shadows in the installation above them were getting closer. Mara could feel the edge of the transition window. Hers had closed, but Sarah's was running, and the resonance bleeding off Sarah was faint but readable. The soft, specific warmth of her sister's neural signature that Mara had been finding in. The dark for 6 days. Jump first, Mara said. I'll be right behind you. Sarah jumped. She tucked and rolled. She stood up from the shadow pool at the base of the wall and turned back to look up. And Mara could see her face even in the dark, that specific expression that was not quite a smile, the one she'd had since she was 8 years old, the one that meant I landed. I'm fine. Your turn. Mara jumped. They ran. The perimeter wall was 2 meters high and topped with sensor filament, and Mara had identified the blind spots on day 3, and they cleared it without triggering anything, and the tree line swallowed them before the exterior lights completed their sweep. Behind them, the installation's amber glow shifted into the faster pulse pattern of active search protocol, and Mara ran with the dying resonance trailing behind her like a wake, the installation's signal growing quieter with every 100 meters until it was just a faint pressure and then nothing at all. She had not run like this in 6 days. The running felt like returning to herself. 6 kilometers out in a dry creek bed choked with alien scrub that smelled like copper and pine, they stopped to rest. Sarah had water. She'd been given water in the analytical hold. The Vorith were not gratuitously cruel, or rather they did not see the point of harming the utility of something they intended to analyze, and she'd stored extra in the container they allowed her, which she'd attached to her belt with the same methodical foresight that had led her to put critical data from 6 days of observations on a data slate that she'd been forced to leave behind. She was angry about the data slate. Mara could tell by the way she was quiet about it, a different quality of quiet than her usual. Tell me what was on it, Mara said. I don't need to. It's here. Sarah tapped her temple. Most of it. The Vorith analytical staff were surprisingly open. I think they considered me non-threatening enough to work around. I've mapped 3 previously unknown aspects of their neurological immune system, and I think I understand what compound Lana is doing in your brain better than Dr. Yen does. Mara looked at her. What do you mean? Dr. Yen designed it to replicate Vorath neurological output during the transition window, which it does. But that's not all it's doing. Sarah pulled her knees to her chest, and her eyes in the dark were very focused the way they got when she was in the middle of solving something. The Vorith analytical staff use a process called resonance cartography. They map the neural outputs of captured assets to build communication models. They've been running scans on you since you arrived. I know. I felt the scans. You felt them. Sarah paused. That's what I'm talking about. Mara, the cross-resonance isn't a side effect. The receiving function isn't incidental to the design. The compound wasn't designed to replicate Vorath output. That's the visible part, the part Yen could document and measure. What it's actually doing is making human neural architecture bidirectionally compatible with Vorath neurological systems. Not just the hardware, the biology. You're saying it's doing something she didn't intend. I'm saying it's doing something she didn't know to look for. The Vorath analytical staff were very excited about your scans, not because you can open their locks, because your brain, in the transition window, is running a novel hybrid architecture that neither species has ever produced. Sarah was quiet for a moment. They called it a bridge state, and they were specifically interested in what it might mean for the parts of Vorath biology that are failing. The cold in the creek bed settled a little further into Mara's bones. What parts of Vorath biology are failing? Sarah looked at her. That's a longer conversation. But the short version is, the Vorath don't have a hollow cycle. They've never had one. They don't sleep. They run continuous consciousness across their entire lifespan. And it's been efficient for them, and it's worked for the better part of 40,000 years. She paused, and approximately 300 years ago, something changed in their neurological architecture at the species level, and the continuous consciousness started to generate compounding instability, and nobody on their side has been able to figure out why. Mara stared at her. They've been trying to solve it, Sarah said. The processing installations aren't primarily for analyzing captured military assets. That's secondary. The primary function is research. They're trying to find a biological solution to a neurological crisis that's been slowly escalating for 3 centuries. They've conquered 12 species worth of worlds, and not one of them had anything that looked like a solution. She looked at Mara with that not quite smile, and then they scanned you. The creek bed was very quiet. Some kind of insect, if it was an insect, made a sound like 2 pieces of glass rubbing together, somewhere in the scrub. They don't want to talk to us, Mara said slowly. They want to fix themselves. They want to understand the bridge state. Not as a weapon, as a template. Sarah's voice was careful, the way it always was when she was laying out something that had significant implications that she was choosing not to overstate. The transition window your brain creates isn't just a copy of their output. It's something new. It's the specific interaction between a human holocycle and Vorath-compatible architecture. It can only exist in a brain that has both things. And as far as the analytical staff can determine, there are exactly 17 humans on the planet who have taken compound Lana. 17 who survived the protocol, Mara said. Yes, and they need that. They need to understand it. Whether they get there through cooperation or through dissection is a different question. Mara thought about Velshara, crouching in front of the cage with her copper-edged crest and her flat translator voice asking, "Does the gap distress you? Does it distress you? Losing half your existence to the dark?" She thought about the answer she'd given, which she'd meant as defiance, but which now seemed different. Like she'd been accurate in a way she hadn't known. You spend your whole existence not knowing what the dark feels like. She hadn't meant it as an answer to anything. She'd meant it as a retort. But it was an answer to everything, apparently. The dark was what they were missing. Not the gap itself, but what the gap produced. The architecture that could only grow in a brain that had learned to be unconscious. To let go. To trust that it would return. The Vorath had been running for 40,000 years, and they had never learned to trust the dark, and now they were breaking. She stood up. "We finish the exfil," she said. "We get to the fob. I report Dar and debrief on the transmission. And then," she paused, "and then I think we have a very different conversation about this war than anyone has been planning to have." Sarah looked at her steadily. "You want to use it as leverage. I want to use it as a bridge. There's a difference." "There is. You'll need to explain that difference to Dar very clearly." "I know." And to the Vorath, "I know." The commander of the installation, Velorath. "Her daughter seemed interested in you." "Her daughter was trying to understand my protocol." Mara started walking. "Let her." They reached the fob at hour 7 of the new window, which gave them 5 hours before dormancy, which was enough time to debrief, enough time for the signals team to confirm the transmission had been received and processed and was already producing actionable intelligence on 14 previously uncharted installations, and enough time for Colonel Dar to sit across from Mara in the briefing tent with a cup of something hot, and his expression that meant he was very close to saying something either very good or very bad. "The transmission came through clean," he said. "Full network map. 14 sites, patrol patterns, communication frequencies. The analysts say it'll take the Vorath at least 48 hours to realize we have it, and probably longer to figure out how we got it. He drank from his cup. You want to tell me why you're not more pleased about that? Because it's not the most important thing I brought back, Mara said. She told him what Sarah had told her. Dar was quiet for a long time after she finished. He was a man who had spent 30 years learning how to be quiet in ways that contained entire conversations, and Mara watched the particular quality of this silence and tried to read it. You're saying the war can stop, he said at last. I'm saying the reason the war started might not be the reason we think it is. They didn't come here for resources. They didn't come here for territory. They came here because they're dying, and they were looking for something to save them, and they found it in the last species they expected to have anything useful. She paused. They found it in the gap. In the weakness, Dar said. Not ironically, just repeating it. In the hollow cycle. Yes, he was quiet again. They've killed hundreds of thousands of people, Sergeant. I know, sir. They leveled the Jakarta colony. They hit the Vega Station med-evacuation convoy. I know. Telling me they have a neurological crisis does not make me feel substantially different about any of that. No, sir. But it might change what we can ask them to stop doing. She met his eyes. If we have something they need, genuinely need, not want, need, that changes the negotiation. Not in their favor, in ours. Another silence. The briefing tent's canvas wall shivered in the wind outside. A human sound. A sound that had been common on every forward operating base since the concept of forward operating bases was invented. And Mara found it steadying in the way she'd always found it steadying. Proof of continuity. Proof that some things persisted. Your sister could document all of this? Dar asked. She has most of it in her head already. She'll need lab access in 3 days. She'll have it. He set down his cup. And the 17 of you who took the compound, you'd be the point of contact for any biological exchange program. Presumably, you're comfortable with that. Mara thought about the transition window, about the cold clarity of it, the resonance, the vast quiet hum of a world that was suddenly legible in a way nothing had prepared her for. She thought about Dr. Yen saying unprecedented, repeatedly, with slightly too much energy in her voice, the energy of someone who had seen something no one else had seen yet. It doesn't reverse, she said. I've had the compound for 4 months. The bridge state is permanent. Whatever I am now, I stay this way. She paused. So yeah, I'm comfortable with it. Dar looked at her for a moment that contained something she recognized as respect, though he would never have called it that. Get some sleep, he said. 2 more hours in the window first. I want to write the full debrief while the details are clear. 2 hours, then sleep. He stood. I'm going to make some calls. This is above my pay grade. And I'm going to pretend it isn't for exactly long enough to get the initial contact framework in place. She almost smiled. Yes, sir. The contact request came from the Vorath side 41 hours later. Mara was not surprised. She had spent those 41 hours writing detailed reports, briefing xenobiology, reviewing everything Sarah had extracted and cross-referencing it against the intelligence from the transmission, and sitting in the pre-dawn quiet of the fob with a cup of tea and her own thoughts, which were surprisingly calm. She had also spent a few of those hours in the cramped bunk room she shared with 3 other soldiers, lying on her back in the dark during dormancy, and she had noticed, not for the first time, but with more clarity than before, the specific quality of the transition into sleep, the way the world narrowed and then released, and how it was not frightening, and had never been frightening. Not once in her life, not even as a child. You lay down, you let go. You trusted that the morning would be there when you came back. She had always trusted that. She had never known it was unusual until the Vorath had told her. She thought about that in the dark before the dormancy took her. The specific strangeness of spending your whole life in a state that another species had spent 40,000 years trying to avoid, and not knowing it was strange because it had always been the whole world. Some advantages look exactly like limitations until the right angle of light hits them. The contact came through a channel she recognized. The frequency she'd learned in the installation's communications array, one of the ones the Vorath used for internal staff communication. Someone had reconfigured it for external broadcast. Someone who knew that the humans would be listening on that frequency. Because the only way the humans would know to listen on that frequency was if they'd pulled it from an installation's internal systems, which meant someone on the Vorath side had known exactly what the transmission was and what it had contained and had chosen to use it as a way to open communication rather than a vulnerability to be closed. The voice that came through was Velshara's. Her translator chip rendered it flat and without inflection. But Mara could read Vorath intonation now. Partially, incompletely. The same way you read a language you've been learning for 6 months, enough to catch the broad shape of it, and the broad shape of Velshara's intonation was something she identified after a moment as difficult. Not hostile, difficult. The quality of a person doing something that costs them. You took our network map, Velshara said, and you didn't use it. Not yet, Mara said. My mother analyzed the output. She says you could have taken 3 installations with the patrol patterns alone. You chose not to. I wanted to talk first. A pause. You wanted, a single sergeant wanted. And the humans are talking first because one sergeant chose to, more or less. The pause was longer this time. You are still a very strange human. You already told me that. I am telling you again, in case the meaning was unclear. Another pause. My mother wishes to speak with your command authority. I am relaying this because a hesitation in the tone, something that cost more than the rest, because the transmission you sent did not only contain network data. There was an additional component, a secondary signal embedded in the primary broadcast that our analytical division has been working to decode for the past 40 hours. Mara was quiet. It is your neural record, Velshara said, from the transition window. The full bridge state architecture encoded in the transmission carrier wave. Another pause. You gave it to us. I gave you a copy of it, Mara said, not the original. The original is still in my brain. This distinction matters to you. Very much. Why? Mara thought about how to answer this. Thought about Sarah in the analytical hold, taking notes on alien biology with a data slate. Thought about Dr. Yen naming a compound after her daughter because she loved her. Thought about the dark and what you learned in it and why the learning mattered. Because the copy tells you what the bridge state looks like, she said. But understanding why it exists, why it can only exist in a brain that's learned to let go, that part isn't in the data. That part you have to have a conversation about. She paused. I wanted to make sure you'd want to have the conversation. Velshura was silent for a long time. My mother, she said at last, has ordered me to inform you that the dialogue you are proposing will require certain assurances, cessation of offensive operations within a defined corridor, exchange of biological research access, a temporary and verifiable halt to installation activity within the zones covered by your transmitted network map. Another pause, and then something that was not quite hesitation, but that occupied the same space. She has also ordered me to tell you that she reviewed the recording of our conversation in the holding chamber. The question I asked about the dormancy period. I remember. And your answer? Mara waited. She says you were right, Velshara said. About the dark. She says the Varath have had no word for what you were describing because we have never experienced it. And we never knew it was a word we needed. A final pause, and in the intonation underneath the flat translation, Mara heard something she had not expected to hear from a Vorath. Something that took her a moment to identify because it was something she associated with human voices. She says to tell you we have been afraid of it, and we have spent a very long time being afraid of the wrong thing. The briefing tent was very still. Dawn was coming up outside, the alien sun, the light that was slightly too orange, warming the canvas to a deep amber that was almost the same color as the installation walls, almost the same color as the crystalline resin, and Mara thought, everything here is the same color as the light, because the light made everything, the same way the dark makes everything in the dark. I'll have Colonel Dar contact your mother directly, she said, and I want Dr. Sarah Voss included in the biological research dialogue from the start, non-negotiable. The researcher, a faint quality in Velshara's tone that Mara could not quite read, the one who was taking notes. Yes, she asked our analytical division whether they had the equivalent of a word for what it felt like to learn something new, whether their language had a concept for the specific quality of encountering an idea that rearranged previously settled knowledge. What did they say? They said yes, they gave her the word. A pause. She wrote it down. Mara smiled. It was the first full smile in 6 days, and she didn't try to stop it. She would. The negotiation took 4 months. Mara was not present for most of it. She was not a diplomat, had not been trained as one. And Dar very wisely pulled in people who were better suited to the sustained precision work of formal agreement, building. She briefed, she provided context, she was available for the cross-resonance consultations that became a critical component of the process, because the 17 compound Lana volunteers could feel, at a fundamental neurological level, whether their counterparts were operating in good faith, could read the architecture of intention in ways that no amount of translation technology could replicate, and it turned out to be exactly as valuable as Dr. Yen had believed it would be, which was very. There were hard days. Days when the formal sessions stalled, and the translators went home with headaches, and the analysts produced projections that were not optimistic. There were days when the history of 3 years of warfare sat in the negotiating room like a physical presence, making the air thick, making every careful word cost something. The Vorath had done things that had no clean accounting, had killed people who had names and families and stories that deserved to be more than footnotes in a military assessment. The humans had hit back as hard as they could, and their best had not been enough, and the bitterness of that was real and legitimate, and not something that 4 months of biological research exchange was going to resolve. But the research exchange kept happening. Sarah's team and the Vorath Analytical Division kept producing documentation that neither side could produce alone. And the 17 volunteers kept showing up to the resonance consultation sessions, and the Vorath negotiating team kept showing up, and slowly, across 4 months of very hard work, the sessions stopped stalling. Mara was not present for most of it. She ran perimeter assessments and contributed to the ongoing decommissioning timeline review and filed reports, and did the normal work of a sergeant in a theater of operations that was transitioning from active conflict to something that did not yet have a name but was moving in a direction that was not war. She was present for the moments that mattered. The day the joint research team published their first preliminary findings, and the Vorath analytical lead, a biologist named Vel Korath, who was technically Vel Orith's second cousin and clearly furious about being assigned a role that required sustained proximity to humans, forwarded a 3-word message to Sarah's terminal that read, "This is correct." The day one of the other 17 volunteers, a young corporal named Isak, barely 22, from a town in Norway that had been hit in the first wave, came to Mara and said he'd sat across the table from a Vorath negotiator during a resonance session and had, for the first time in 2 years, been unable to maintain the hatred because what he'd felt in the resonance was something that complicated the hatred past the point where it was still useful as a way of being in the world. Isak said this with a kind of bewildered grief, as if he were reporting the loss of something he'd depended on. Mara had sat with him for a while and not tried to make it better, because some things didn't get better, they just got different, and different was its own kind of hard. Sarah was in the laboratory every day for those 4 months. The Vorath neurologists and the human xenobiologists worked in adjacent spaces connected by a shared data system and mediated by a team of translators who spent the first month nearly losing their minds, and the second month finding a functional rhythm, and the third month producing the first genuine collaborative research document in the history of two species that had spent 3 years trying to kill each other. Mara stopped by the lab when she could, watched her sister bent over alien equipment with a stylus and a focused expression and the same quality of stillness she had in the analytical hold, which was not resignation but its precise opposite, the specific intensity of someone fully present in what they were doing. She thought sometimes about what Velshara had said. My mother says we have been afraid of it, afraid of the dark, the gap, the hollow cycle, not of darkness itself, but of the vulnerability it represented, the loss of control, the state of helpless unconsciousness that to Vorath perception was simply death occurring on a schedule. They had looked at humanity and seen a species that experienced partial death every single day and continued anyway, had gotten up from it over and over, had built a civilization on the rhythm of it, had, in the specific case of 17 volunteers who'd said yes to an experimental compound, turned it into the very mechanism of their own understanding. They had called it a weakness. They had been so wrong. Mara was in the northeast corridor of the diplomatic complex, waiting for Dar to finish a sub-session on the installation decommissioning timeline when Velshara found her. It had become a habit over the 4 months for Velshara to find her. The commander's first daughter was not officially part of the negotiating team. Her role was observational, a combination of cultural liaison and strategic assessment. But she had a gift for appearing wherever Mara was, standing slightly too close, and asking questions that were not quite what they appeared to be on the surface. The dormancy cycle, Velshara said, without preamble. She had stopped using preamble around Mara approximately 6 weeks in. You're about to enter the transition window. In about an hour, yeah. The research division has been tracking the outputs of all 17 volunteers over the past 4 months. The bridge state architecture is stabilizing, becoming more defined. She paused. Less like interference, more like a signal, I know. I can tell. The transition window felt different now than it had in the installation. Less like being pulled open, and more like arriving somewhere she'd been before. Like the architecture she'd built over 4 months was settling into the specific shape of her. Velshara was quiet for a moment. Her crest full burgundy now, the transition from youth completed sometime in the 3rd month of negotiations, was relaxed, neutral, the resting state display of someone who had stopped performing composure and started actually being calm. My mother wants to formally acknowledge the debt. Mara glanced at her. The what? The negotiator's language has been very precise about framing the biological exchange as mutual benefit, equal partnership, shared research. My mother. Velshara paused. My mother finds that framing accurate but incomplete. She believes there is something additional that the formal language does not capture, which is that you had the network map, that you could have acted on it, that you didn't. A pause, that you sent the bridge state data as a gesture before the negotiation began, without asking anything in return, that the 17 of you made your own biology permanently available to this process before you had any assurance that the process would succeed. Velshara's crest moved in the slow oscillation of active thought. My mother says these were acts that had no strategic necessity, that they incurred real cost to those who performed them, that in Vorath understanding, these acts have a category. They are what is done for something or someone you have decided is worth the cost. Mara was quiet. She does not have the word for this in standard Vorath, Velshara said. The analytical division gave Dr. Voss the word, the one for encountering an idea that rearranges settled knowledge. My mother has been using that word to describe the past 4 months. The rearranging. She paused one last time. She would like to meet with you, not officially, not with translators present. Just the two of you, before the formal agreement signature. I'd like that, Mara said. She will come to you during your transition window. She wants you to be able to feel whether she means what she says. Mara looked at her. She stopped. Tell her I'll be in the East Garden at hour 10. Velshara nodded once. The short formal acknowledgement that had become, Mara had come to understand, the Vorath equivalent of the particular kind of nod that means something more than the movement suggests. She left. Mara leaned against the corridor wall and listened to the alien building settle around her. The very faint hum of its processing systems, the distant murmur of the negotiators' voices, the world remaking itself one slow conversation at a time. Commander Velorith arrived in the East Garden at precisely hour 10. She was not what Mara had imagined, which was foolish. She had met Vorath commanders before, had fought against Vorath commanders. But she had not imagined Velorath as the person she saw walking across the garden path. The commander was older than the intelligence files had suggested. Her crest was the deep, almost black burgundy of late maturity, and she carried a weight in her movement that was not age but experience, the same weight that Dar carried and that all long service officers developed, which was the weight of knowing exactly how much every decision had cost and having chosen it anyway. She stopped 3 meters from Mara and looked at her. The 2 guards at the perimeter were invisible, which meant they were doing their job correctly. The diplomatic complex's East Garden was a compromise architecture, half human, with low stone seating and a water feature fed by the local water table, and half Vorath, with the warm amber crystalline elements they put in every space they occupied for any length of time, as if the crystal was a habit they couldn't break. The garden had been designed by a committee and looked exactly like something designed by a committee, and yet there was something in it that worked, some accidental coherence that came from 2 sets of aesthetic instincts, both reaching for the same thing from different directions. Mara was fully in the transition window. The resonance was open and steady around her, reading the garden, the building behind it, the soft, warm signatures of 2 guards stationed at the perimeter who had been instructed to remain out of sight and were doing a good job of it, and reading Velorath, who was, in the resonance, in the specific quality of her neural signature at this distance, something Mara had no word for in either language. She would have to ask Sarah if there was a word for it. Something that had been in pain for a long time and was in the specific stage that came just before the pain eased. Sergeant Voss, Velorath said. The translator chip rendered her voice flat, but the intonation underneath it, the real voice, the Vorath pitch language, was different in register from anything Mara had heard in the negotiations, lower, more even, not the performance of calm, but the genuine article. Commander, Mara said, my daughter told me you said you were afraid. In the cage, that you were afraid but chose not to display it. Yes, I have been trying to understand this distinction between experiencing fear and displaying it. Velorath paused. Vorath warriors do not typically distinguish between the two. The fear is information. Displaying it is sharing the information with those around you. For humans, fear is also information, Mara said. But who you share it with matters and when. You shared it with me, not at the time. No, at the time you withheld it. You shared it afterward, in the conversation with my daughter, knowing that I would review the recording. The commander tilted her head very slightly. You wanted me to know. Mara thought about this. I wanted you to know that it was a choice, not an absence. A choice to not let fear be the thing that defined the interaction, to be in the cage with you and still be something that decided for itself what it showed and what it kept. She paused. It seemed important that you know the difference existed. Velorith was still for a long moment. We are not afraid of you, she said at last. We were not afraid of humans when we came here. We came because we were afraid of ourselves, of what is happening in our own biology, and the fear translated into, what it translated into, aggression, dominance behavior, the methodology of a species that responds to what it cannot control by attempting to control everything around it. Her voice was even. This is not an excuse. I am providing context. I understand the difference, Mara said. My daughter says you always do. The commander paused. She is asked to be assigned to the Post-Agreement Liaison Program, the ongoing biological research exchange. She wants to work with your sister's team. My sister would welcome that. I know. Velshara has already spoken to Dr. Voss informally. A pause that was very brief. They appear to have begun a friendship. I am told this started with a shared interest in a specific untranslatable word, the one for encountering something that rearranges what you knew. Yes, the commander's crest moved once, the slow oscillation. I would like to know the human word for it, if there is one. Mara thought about it. The moment on the maintenance lattice, when Sarah had told her about the bridge state, and she'd understood that everything she thought this was had been wrong, and underneath the wrongness was something truer and stranger and better. The moment in the creek bed when the alien insect made its glass rubbing sound, and she'd felt the whole shape of the situation settle into a form she hadn't anticipated. The moment 4 months ago, in the pre-dawn of the FOB, sitting with tea and her own thoughts, which had been calm in the way that things are calm when they know they are about to change. Discovery, she said. That's the closest one. But it doesn't quite capture it. Discovery is usually about finding something new. What you're describing is more about the moment where something old gets disassembled. She paused. We have a phrase for it sometimes. Having the rug pulled out. It sounds negative. But there's a version of it that isn't. Velorath was quiet. My daughter said, you told her that the dark is not something you should be afraid of, that spending half your existence in it was not a weakness, that we were missing something by not knowing it. Yes, I have been thinking about this for 4 months. The commander looked at her steadily, the full Vorath-sustained gaze. The one that Mara had learned was neither aggression nor submission, but something more specific, attention as a form of respect. You did not know, when you said it, that you were describing the cause of our crisis. No, I was just, Mara paused. I was trying to say something true. You were. Velorith paused. In the Vorath research tradition, when a finding resolves a problem that has been unsolved for a significant period, there is a formal acknowledgement. It is not gratitude, precisely. We do not have the same architecture of gratitude as what I understand your species uses. It is more, she paused. It is the acknowledgement that the problem existed, that the solution was not found by those who should have found it, and that the finding came from an unexpected source through means that were not anticipated. Another pause. It is the acknowledgement that the answer was always available, and we were looking in the wrong direction. Mara was quiet. I am giving you that acknowledgement, Velorath said, for yourself, for your sister, for the 17 of you who made yourselves into something new, before you had any reason to believe it would matter. The crest oscillation had stopped. The commander was perfectly still. And I am telling you that when my daughter stood in that holding cell and watched you and went back to tell me that you were different than she expected, I should have listened more carefully to what she meant. What did you tell her? I told her that humans were a subject of study, not a subject of concern. A pause. She told me she believed I was wrong. I told her to update her models. She was correct to maintain her position. The first very slight alteration in the commander's flat translated voice, not warmth, exactly, but something adjacent to it, the warm tonal undertone of a parent discussing a child who has demonstrated something they're proud of. She told me, Mother, the human is not afraid of the gap. She has learned to trust what she cannot see. We have not learned this. She has something we have not learned, and I want to understand it. Mara looked at the commander. The transition window was at its peak, the resonance open and steady and full, the whole garden readable, the whole complex behind them humming its soft, constant hum. And Velorith's signal in the resonance had shifted in the past few minutes from the complex aching quality to something simpler. Something that Mara found she had no trouble naming at all. Relief. Velshara's models are good, Mara said. They are. She updates them whenever the evidence requires it. The commander's crest made one very small, very precise movement. I have decided to do the same. She paused. The formal agreement will be signed in 3 days. It will end the offensive operations and establish the exchange framework. This is correct. It is necessary. But I wanted to have this conversation before it became official. A pause. I wanted to speak with you as one commander to another without the agreement between us. Before the agreement existed. Why? Because after it exists, Velorith said, there are obligations attached to it. Formalities. The weight of what was built. And I wanted to say before all of that, before the record, before the history of it, that we came here looking for something we thought we could take. And what we found was something we could only receive. And the difference, the pause was the longest yet. The difference is one I did not understand before your species showed it to me. The East Garden was quiet. A breeze moved through it, carrying the copper and pine smell of the equatorial belt, carrying the warmth of the alien sun, which Mara had stopped thinking of as alien approximately a month ago, and had simply started thinking of as the sun, the way you stop noticing the specific quality of familiar light and simply see. I'll be there at the signing, Mara said, and my sister will be there. And I'll tell you what the human word is for the thing that happens when something you thought was your weakness turns out to be the thing that everything else was built on. Tell me now. Mara thought about the first morning after her first window, how she'd woken up disoriented and strange and full of noise she couldn't name, and how Sarah had been sitting beside her with a cup of water and a very calm expression and had said, "You're all right. You just have to learn to read it, the resonance, the sound of everything around you, talking all at once." She thought about the specific act of learning to read it, of sitting in the briefing room 3 days after the compound injection, with every electronic device in the room bleeding data into her augmented nervous system, and the noise was overwhelming, and she'd had a moment of pure panic, the kind that lives below training, below discipline, the animal brain screaming about something it had never been designed to process. And then, because she was Mara Voss, and she had been doing difficult things calmly since she was old enough to understand that calmness was a choice, she had closed her eyes and simply listened, had let the noise be noise for a while, had stopped trying to make it mean anything before she understood what it was, and slowly, over 3 days, the noise had become signal. She thought about what that had felt like, the moment when the chaos organized itself into pattern, when the overwhelming became the legible, when the thing that had been drowning her became the thing that let her see in the dark. She thought about Sarah, sleeping 14 hours, always the one who needed more of the dark than Mara did, who had built the most comprehensive xenobiological research framework in human history, because she had learned, in a way that no one who only lived in the light could have, how to be patient with what you couldn't yet see. Foundation, she said. We call it a foundation, the thing you build on, the thing that looks like nothing until you need it. Velorith was still for a long time. The garden held its breath. Somewhere in the building behind them, Mara could feel through the fading resonance the muffled warmth of the negotiating team still at work, the patient grinding effort of people trying to build something better than what had come before, and it was the most human sound she'd heard in months, and she thought, this is what we do. When we have enough dark, when we've slept enough to know that the waking is worth returning to, this is what we do with the light we have. That, she said finally, is a word we have in Vorath. I know, Mara said. Your daughter taught it to me. The formal agreement was signed on a clear morning under the orange sun, in a room that was half human construction and half Vorath crystalline resin, which was the kind of architecture that had no precedent but looked, somehow, exactly right. The negotiations had produced, in the end, a document that was 63 pages long in Standard and 87 in Vorath, because Vorath legal language was more precise and consequently more verbose than human legal language, and the translators had spent the last 2 weeks of the 4 months simply ensuring that what each document said was genuinely equivalent rather than apparently equivalent, which turned out to be a more difficult task than almost everyone had anticipated. The xenobiological research exchange provisions took up 18 pages. The cross-resonance consultation protocol took up 9. The installation decommissioning timeline was organized across 7 tables that had taken 3 human analysts and 2 Vorath administrative staff a full week to produce. Mara had read all of it, not because she was required to, it was above her rank classification, but because she wanted to. Because it seemed right to read carefully the thing that had cost what it had cost, even the parts that were tables of decommissioning timelines. Dar signed for humanity, Veloroth signed for the Vorath. Mara sat in the 3rd row and watched. Sarah was beside her with a datapad and a stylus, and Mara was fairly certain she was taking notes, because Sarah always took notes, and some habits were deeper than circumstance. She looked over at one point and saw that the notes were in 3 columns: standard, Vorath phonetic transliteration, and what appeared to be Sarah's own shorthand notation system that she'd developed sometime in the past 4 months, and that Mara had never been able to fully decode. The third column was the longest. Velshara was standing at the edge of the Vorath delegation, at a position that in Vorath spatial language indicated liaison observer status, and at the moment the formal signing was complete, she looked across the room directly at Mara, which was unusual. Vorath's social protocol did not involve direct prolonged eye contact in formal settings, and Mara looked back. In the transition window, which was running and steady, Velshara's signal was the bright, specific warmth of someone in the process of revising a very significant model and finding the revised version better than the original. Mara had spent 11 years learning to read people. Humans, mostly, the small signals, the micro expressions, the body language, and the way people carried their fear. The cross-resonance had given her a version of the same reading for Vorath, and 4 months had given her the practice. But some things didn't need training, didn't need the resonance, didn't need anything except the very old and very simple human skill of paying attention to someone looking at you from across a room. She understood what she was looking at. She nodded. Wait, that means more than the movement suggests. Velshara's crest made one small, precise oscillation. Mara had enough Vorath now to read it. She filed the translation away in the part of her memory where she stored things she expected to need, which now included a specific Vorath expression that mapped cleanly onto a human feeling she'd been carrying since a cold alien morning on a maintenance platform above an equatorial installation, looking down at her sister standing as a shadow pool and making the face that meant, I landed, I'm fine, your turn. Which was, I see you, I understand what this cost, I won't forget it. She didn't try to stop the smile this time either. After the signing, there was a reception. The diplomatic staff had organized it with the careful thoroughness of people who understood that the formal ceremony was the visible event, but the informal gathering afterward was where the real work of human to alien relationship happened in the smaller conversations, the first name exchanges, the moment when someone offered food from their side to someone from the other side, and both of them navigated the biology of it with more or less grace. Mara ate something from the Vorath refreshment table that tasted like very concentrated mineral water and was apparently considered a significant gesture when consumed by a non-Vorath, which she only learned after she had already consumed it from the slightly alarmed expression on the face of the Vorath liaison standing nearby. Is that bad? She asked Velshara, who had materialized at her elbow. It is considered a statement of trust. It has shared significant transitions. Velshara paused. It is also mildly toxic to humans in quantities above approximately 3 portions. Mara looked at the half-empty container in her hand. How many portions is this? Approximately 1.5. Velshara's crest was doing the oscillation that meant active thought. You should be fine. You may have unusual dreams during your next dormancy period. Mara set the container down. Unusual how? Vivid, clear. Possibly involving sounds that are difficult to describe after waking. A pause. Some of our researchers believe this is how the compound interacts with a compound already in your system. The bridge state becomes temporarily more permeable during the mineral water compound's metabolic cycle. More permeable to what? Velshara looked at her. We are not certain. We intend to study it. The crest oscillated once more. My mother believes it is the dark speaking, that the human dormancy state under those conditions becomes briefly more legible. To those of us who do not experience it. She paused. I think she is being poetic. She is rarely poetic. I think the past 4 months have changed something in how she uses language. Mara thought about this, about what it might mean for a species that had never known darkness to get the briefest possible glimpse of it. Not the absence of light, but the architecture of rest, the state of trust, the specific kind of knowing that comes from having let go and come back, to see it, even obliquely, even through the chemical residue in someone else's blood. Tell your researchers, she said, that when they study it, they should start by asking what it feels like to wake up. Velshara tilted her head. We have a word, Mara said, for the specific quality of the first moment of consciousness after dormancy, the way the world comes back, the way you remember where you are and why it matters. She paused. You don't have that word, but you might need it going forward. What is the word? Mara smiled. Ask my sister. She's the one who writes things down, Dr. Yen cried at the debrief. Not the formal military debrief that one she handled with complete professionalism, as Mara had expected, because Dr. Yen was a person who kept her composure precisely as long as it was required, and then allowed it to dissolve at the exact first opportunity when it wasn't. She was 51 years old and had spent 9 of the past 12 years working on the compound that bore her daughter's name. Through funding cuts and failed iterations, and the loss of colleagues who were less certain than she was, that it was worth pursuing. She had presented the cross-resonance data to a room full of skeptical military officials in the second year of the war, and they had given her provisional approval with the specific quality of provisional approval that means, we don't believe this will work, but we've run out of better ideas. She had built it anyway. She had been right. She cried at the end of the day, in her lab after the last of the formal sessions, when it was just her and Mara, and the faint hum of the equipment, and the research notes that covered every available surface with the handwriting of 4 years of work. I didn't know, she said, about the receiving function, about the bridge state. You couldn't have known, Mara said. You built the part you could see, the part no one could see, that part built itself. That's not how it works. That's not how any of this works. I should have. Mara waited for her to look up. You named it after your daughter, the compound. A pause. Yes, because it was something you made to keep the people you cared about from dying. Because the best work you knew how to do was also an act of, you know what the Vorath call it when you do something that has real cost, because you decided something is worth it? Dr. Yen was quiet. My sister can give you the word, Mara said. She wrote it down, Doctor. Yen laughed through the crying. It sounded like the end of something and the beginning of something else. Mara stayed for another hour. She didn't need to. Her debrief was complete. Her reports were filed. The signals team had confirmed full network extraction from the transmission, and the intelligence was already producing operational results at 6 of the 14 mapped sites. There was nothing more she needed to do in this lab tonight. She stayed because Dr. Yen had spent 9 years in this lab, and the lab deserved to have someone sit in it with the weight of what had happened and not immediately leave. That was a human thing, staying. Not useful, strategically. Not something that moved any objective forward. Just the specific acknowledgement that some things deserved witness. She thought the Vorath might not understand that. Or they might now. The research exchange was producing a lot of things that moved in both directions. She left when Dr. Yen had finished the tea she'd made, and the crying had stopped, and the lab was full of the very particular quiet that comes after something. Significant has been acknowledged and absorbed and filed in the place where significant things go. 6 months after the agreement, in the first collaborative research publication produced by the Joint Biological Exchange Program, there was a footnote. The footnote read, "The bridge state architecture described in this document would not have been observed or documented without the participation of 17 human volunteers who underwent irreversible neurological modification with no guarantee of outcome. The research team acknowledges this foundational contribution with the full weight the Vorath language has available for such acknowledgement, and notes that the nearest human equivalent is also the word the human members of the research team have chosen as the informal name for the architecture itself. The word was Lana, not because of Dr. Yen's daughter, though that was where the compound had gotten its name, and the compound was where everything had started, but because of what the name had come to mean in the 6 months since the agreement, in the shared vocabulary that grew between the two research teams the way shared vocabularies do, organically and inevitably, and faster than anyone expects. The specific bridge between two things that should not be able to speak to each other, made from the most improbable material, held in place by nothing more structural than the decision of one person to remain what they were. Mara read the footnote 3 times. Then she went to find her sister. Sarah was in the lab, bent over alien equipment with a stylus, focused and present, and entirely herself. She looked up when Mara came in, and her expression was the same as it always was. The specific calm that was not distance but the opposite of distance, the state of being so fully in the room that nothing needed to be performed. Did you see the footnote? Mara asked. I wrote it, Sarah said. Mara stood in the doorway for a moment. The lab smelled of the chemical solutions Sarah used, and the faint mineral note of the Vorath equipment, and underneath both of those things, the familiar human lab smell of coffee and work, because Sarah had always had coffee somewhere near whatever she was doing, in the family kitchen and in the university lab and in the Fabi medical tent, and apparently here too, the first joint xenobiological research facility, in the recorded history of two species finding their way toward each other. You could have asked me, Mara said. I didn't need to. Sarah set down the stylus. You took the compound first. You always go first. Then you look back to make sure I'm still there. A pause. You've done that since you were 6 years old. You always land, Mara said. I always land. Sarah looked at her with a not-qui smile. Your turn. The alien sun came through the lab window at the angle it always came through at this hour. The orange warm light that had stopped being foreign months ago, that had become simply the light of the place she was, and Mara stepped through the doorway into it, and the transition window hummed steady around her, and the world was full of sound she had learned to read, and every sound was, in its own way, legible, and none of it was noise anymore. None of it had ever been noise, once you knew how to listen.